Welcome. My name is Samantha and I'm Fssc's Communication Manager. I would like to welcome you to this Fssc Insights webinar dedicated to the topic of food fraud. And during this webinar, we have three special speakers here. First, I'd like to welcome Dr. John Spink, food fraud expert and assistant professor at Michigan State University. Welcome, John. John is going to introduce to us the trends in the field of food fraud and provide us a bit more insight into the topic. Then we have here Elsbie Mati, our Fssc Technical Director. She will introduce the topic of food fraud and talk about the Fssc 22000 requirements regarding food fraud. And also we have a topic dedicated to certificate fraud. Then last but not least, here is Cor Groenveld. Cor is Fssc's Market Development Director, and he's here to kick off this webinar and to introduce to us Foundation Fssc. But before we start, first I would like to take you through a few practicalities. As you notice, you're all muted. That is because we have quite a large crowd joining us today. So it's not possible to use your mic, but it is possible to ask us questions. Please use the Q&A functionality in Zoom to ask us questions, because this way we can moderate and select questions to answer at the end of the presentations. Then, the most frequently asked question, will this webinar be recorded and do we get a recording? Well, yes, the webinar will be recorded and you will receive the recording and the presentations later this week. We will also add a bit of additional information like our guidance document about food fraud. Well, I think that's enough from my side. So I'd like to hand over to Cor. Cor, the floor is yours. Here you go.
Thank you so much, Samantha. What a great introduction, and I'm very happy that you all take the time and the effort to join this webinar. This is the third webinar, and we started this year with our Insight webinars, and that is to reach out to the public, and the interest is very high, and we're very happy with that. And there will be another one this year, so please make sure that you put it in your agenda. And we will also continue with this next year. I will do it very shortly because the real experts need to talk today and not me. But I like to give you a few insights on Fssc and Fssc 22000 before we start. So what you see here, I think that is important, is what we call our branded house. And you find here very important elements of our vision and mission. Everyone needs a house, and a house needs to have a good fundament. I think that's important. And you find our values, the 5 values we have in our fundament: transparency, integrity, ambition, engagement, and care. And we think these are very important, not only external, but also internally. So we value these values very highly. Then we have 3 pillars where Fssc is built on. That's the schemes we have. Of course, Fssc 22000 is at this moment most important. But we are working on extension of our scopes, and you will hear more about that in this year. Assurance, making sure that certification is reliable, because that is most important, that certification is reliable, that you can trust on a certificate, and that the audits are reliable. And we work very closely together with our great partners, certification bodies, training organizations, accreditation bodies, to ensure that our audits are reliable. And that's also for you most important. And continuously improvement. I mean, you know the Plan, Do, Check, Act. You are all very, very technical people probably, or people who know more about these things than we, but make sure that we have continuous improvement in place. And then in the end, the roof, creating a better world. And we hope that we can contribute in our way to creating that better world together with you. So that is about our branded house. This is a lot of information, this infographic, we realize that, but I think it shows very clearly what Fssc 22000 is. On the left side, you see the partners we have, 127 certification bodies, the training organizations, accreditation bodies, and we have almost 30,000 certificates. In a few months, I think we will reach the 30,000 certificates. But then I directly say, it's not about quantity, it's about quality. Because for us, growth is of course nice, because it shows that organizations appreciate FSSC 24000, that organizations like to use it, they see it as a benefit, but we need to make sure that the quality is on the right level. That's more important for us than the growth. And then on the right side, you see the different scopes we're active in, the food supply chain, from farm to fork, and from some countries, from farm to chopstick, because I think that is depending where you are. But you see that we cover almost the whole food supply chain. And important is we are owned by independent non-profit foundation. I think that's quite unique, and that also shows in our way of working. That non-profit approach. We have a board of stakeholders. They are having the governance over FSSC, and you can read more on our website who are there and what they are doing. This is the final slide I like to show. Booth on the ground, I always say, is important. So we have local representatives in several countries and regions. You can find all the details on our website. You can reach out to them if you have specific questions in the countries and regions they are active in. But you can also reach directly to us by sending us a mail or contacting us. But I think it's important to show that we have regional and local representatives around the world. That's from my side, and now I think the real experts need to talk. So I hand over to Fssc, and she will give you insights on food fraud. Good luck, Fssc.
Thank you, Cor, and welcome everyone to our webinar today. As Cor said, I'm the Technical Director for Fssc, and one of my key responsibilities is looking after our scheme, making sure that it's up to date, relevant, and robust. And that is also why food fraud is a specific requirement in our scheme. Now, during this first part of the webinar, we are going to have a little bit more of an in-depth look at what is the specific requirement and some of the general principles. But before we start with that, let's have a look at what is food fraud. Now, you can see the definition on the screen, and I'm not going to read that out because it is quite a mouthful. But there are two main aspects that you need to look at. The first is that it is a deliberate and intentional act. So whether it is substitution, addition, tampering, or mislabeling, it has been thought about and planned out. And the second important topic is the motivation or the driver, that it is for economic gain. So therefore, food fraud is a premeditated criminal activity with the aim of making money. So let's have a look at what is the FSSC specific additional requirement. And you can find the detail of that in part 2 of our scheme, and specifically clause 2.5.4. Now it consists of two main components, namely having a food fraud vulnerability assessment that also needs to be documented, and then a food fraud mitigation plan. Now, when we look at the food fraud vulnerability assessment, there are sort of three main areas. First, you need to identify and assess what is the potential vulnerabilities. Then develop and implement mitigation and control measures. And finally, prioritize them against those identified vulnerabilities. But when you are identifying the vulnerabilities, the organization have to assess the susceptibility of its products to the potential act of food fraud. Now, what does that mean? You need to go and have a look at what is the likelihood of food fraud taking place in your organization or within your supply chain. And once you have determined the likelihood, you need to determine what would be the severity linked to that. And then, as I mentioned before, the next step is to make sure you implement appropriate control measures, with the emphasis on appropriate and with the aim to reduce or eliminate those identified vulnerabilities. And then the second aspect, as I mentioned before, is having the food fraud prevention plan or the mitigation plan. This needs to be supported by the organization's food safety management system, and it's important that it covers all the processes and products within the scope of certification. The plan also needs to comply with any applicable legislation, and very importantly, it needs to be kept up to date. Now, when you look at the vulnerability assessment, there is a lot of things to consider, and sometimes it can be a little bit overwhelming. And I think the important message is that you need to make sure that you spend the time to do it properly. Because food fraud does not only impact your organization, it can also have an impact on national and even international food trade. But where do you start? So one of the ways, and I'm saying one because there are numerous ways that you can do a vulnerability assessment, is to map out the ingredients that goes into your product and trace that back in the supply chain. So if you look on the screen at the example of the hamburger, you will see it gives a nice visual overview. It highlights the complexities in the supply chain, but it also provides you with insight. But it does not stop with mapping out your ingredients. There are other considerations that you need to take into account. So when you are looking at the likelihood of food fraud, you also need to consider whether there can be dilution, counterfeiting, substitution, or unapproved enhancements. Whether there is grey market production, what is the possibility of theft, for example, or diversion, mislabeling, or concealment. So quite a lot to think about, and for each and every step and each and every ingredient, depending on what it is that you are producing. So when you are doing a vulnerability assessment, you need to think like a criminal, and you need to actively look for potential opportunities for food fraud. And on this slide, you will see there's a couple of other factors to consider. So this is a very complex, but I think very interesting topic. So when you are looking at your vulnerability assessment, you also need to consider factors such as what is the economic vulnerability of your product? So how high the economic value of your product is, the higher the risk is for food fraud, or the more attractive it becomes for food fraud. You need to also look at the historical data. So for example, is there a history of food fraud linked to your industry or linked to your product? But not only historical data is important, it's also very important to make sure that you stay up to date with what is currently the trends in the industry. Because trends, as you know, change over time, and what was relevant 2 years ago might not be relevant anymore today. So you need to make sure that you that you keep an eye on both and keep it in context. And then also, how easy is it to detect food fraud? Do you, for example, have routine screening methods that's available? And when you're looking at the supply chain, it's important to also make sure or to verify where there is access to raw materials, packaging materials, as well as finished products. Another key aspect is the relationship you have with your suppliers. For example, where you have a long-standing relationship with a supplier, that might be a lower risk than with those suppliers where you're only doing spot buying. Whether there is certification in place or there is a specific control system for fraud and authenticity. And then if you think back on our visual example of the hamburger, think about the complexity of the supply chain. So the longer the supply chain is, the higher the possibility of food fraud. Also thinking back of, what is the origin of the ingredients that goes into your product? And looking where your product is substantially being changed or processed, as that also makes it a higher risk for food fraud. Now, when we go back to the requirement for Fssc, as I said, a mitigation strategy is really important. And when you are developing your mitigation strategy, you need to assess the significance of the vulnerabilities that you've identified from your food fraud assessment. And important to remember that when you are looking at the likelihood of occurrence, that the economic driver is what you need to consider. And then, last but not least, the mitigation plan needs to be supported by the food safety management system. And that means that you need to actively include food fraud when you look at training. So making sure that that you're creating awareness when it comes to food fraud. Internal audits. This is your opportunity to challenge the system, and also remember to challenge food fraud and the food fraud assessment that you've done. Management review. And this is very important because you need to have senior management commitment, but also awareness in terms of topics like food fraud. Then looking at your operational mitigation measures, checking that that is still applicable and efficient. Different verification activities. So for example, if you have testing methods in place, verify whether that is still the most appropriate, whether it's accurate. And if you are doing supplier audits, that you also make sure to include food fraud in that. And then specification management as well. I hope that I've given you some insight in terms of the FSSC specific requirement relating to food fraud. But as Samantha mentioned before, we also have a food fraud guidance document where you can find a lot more information. And this document will be shared with you after the presentation or the webinar today, but you can also download it for free from our website under the scheme document section. So I'm now going to hand over to our expert and guest speaker today, John Spenk, or Dr. John Spenk. So we're very happy to have you on board, John. And without further ado, I'm going to add over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. It is an absolute pleasure to be here. FSSC has been a great partner for me. I've learned a lot. I learned a lot this morning just listening to the presentation. So I told the other panelists I'm as excited about learning as you. So also, it's been great to see the participants coming in from literally around the world. So the key is that everything that we do is based on things that we learn from you. So if there's some things in here that you think maybe we didn't cover clearly, or some changes, other questions you have, we're all listening. So food fraud prevention management, implementation and management is the key. So we're going to look at some of the trends on that end of it. If you have any other questions, foodfraudprevention.com is our website, a lot of free resources. And so feel free to contact us. So just real briefly, research, education, and outreach. This type of meeting is outreach. So listening, talking, and then we go back and research. And even this morning, some things popped up about your guidance document, the FSSC guidance document. It's been a while since we all looked at it. I'm going to look at that again and look into see if there's some additional insights maybe. And that goes into education again. Food fraud prevention textbook. This is, I guess, my life's work in one spot. So if you're dealing with food fraud prevention, we tried to put together a single resource for you. We have free online courses. They're MOOCs, they're called. Actually, the audit guide for food fraud and the audit guide for food defense were specifically in support of the FSSC guidance documents. So interesting there, and those are things we're going to be reviewing. Also, two from the USDA National Organic Program, funded by them. So this is training for USDA inspectors. So if you have any organic product coming in the US, then this is how the inspectors are being trained. So everything that we're doing with FSSC, with the GFSI, with laws and regulations, with this type of training, we're all coordinated. So the key is when you listen to this and you follow FSSC, you're following the guidance and the requirements of really things from around the world. We also have other types of resources. Just real briefly, supply chain management book. I'm now in the Department of Supply Chain Management. Looking at food safety and food issues from a supply chain perspective. If you're interested, there's a way to get a link there. It's not published yet, but it will soon. So even before getting started, where am I coming from? And that's always key. Whenever you hear a food fraud presentation, it's important to understand the presenter, the messenger. What's their vested interest? So for me, I represent the science of it. I represent food fraud and reducing it, I guess. Education and is really what our product is. And the way that we looked at it is first early on, things like melamine. Melamine was food safety. So we had to figure out what was making pets sick. And that was really in food safety, food authenticity, doing that type of public health testing. But just finding out why there's a problem isn't solving it, isn't protecting against it. So we had to shift focus to criminology, social science. So I actually went to the School of Criminal Justice, was a faculty member there, and we studied the bad guys, the human adversary. And they look at crime prevention in great detail. So we applied those concepts here. Then we weren't done if we just understood why you're getting sick and the motivation there. We had to go look at how we would organize that. And then part of that was standards and certifications. GFSI was a real key, and obviously GFSI is a fundamental part of Fssc 22000. So having those things like what you just saw, the step-by-step requirements, you could go through and write a sentence about each of those. That's a real key. Standards and certifications. Also to know that those base requirements, a little adjustment from different management systems, but the core, the basics are the same across all GFSI, and GFSI is aligned with government laws and regulations. Even upcoming codex type of activity is included in there. So that's a key, is looking at those type of standards. That includes things like the International Standards Organization. So you'll notice that ISO 22000 is a core base for FSSC 22000. And in ISO are things like quality management, risk management, and management systems. So we've got the systems in place, and then we needed to figure out how much is enough. And that sounds like at the start, that was such a simple question that no one thought it was needed to even be asked. But when we're dealing with food safety and traditional risks, we have already understand that threshold of how bad is bad. With something new, we don't have that threshold, and we didn't really understand the mechanisms. So what we did is then we looked at enterprise risk management for that, and it really gets to be a basic standard operating procedure, which is supply chain management, which is back to what I do. So the key is that we've tried to go through all those sciences, simplify it. So you have things like you just saw that list of FSSC 22000 requirements for food fraud details. And then we're going to dig through here to look at the management system, and that's the key trend we're seeing. So trends update. So food fraud, the vulnerability itself is rapidly evolving and changing. Key is we've got supply chain disruptions. That means shortages of product. So people are trying to find new suppliers, new supply routes, new warehouses. There's more supply chain disruptions of supply routes and transportation strains. So you look at the impact of Ukraine, Russia on transport through that region of the world. And product going in and out of those countries. So that's leading entirely new supply routes. So you might have been used to watching product as it moved across, let's say, through the free trade zone of Panama, but now product might be moving the other way. Supply chain disruptions again. So we had along the way this reduced amount or intensity of oversight. And that was things like, people couldn't travel. They had to adjust the audit systems. You couldn't visit suppliers. You couldn't spend time talking to the truck drivers. And those are they're expanding from really just COVID to just global public health and geopolitical concerns. So we've got some new types of strains on the product in the market that are leading to the fraud opportunity rapidly changing. But if you have a simple system in place, then things should be pretty solid for you. And it's like for your personal health, you don't need to be an expert on every type of illness, like COVID. You don't need to be an expert on COVID, but you rely on your primary doctor, the first doctor that you would visit, to be the expert, to filter that for you. And if you need extra help, they'll send you to the specialists. And that's a real key with food fraud. If you have the base systems in place, these management systems, then you have basically you're doing your own assessment that you can get to the doctor and you can get to the specialist. Inflation, this is going to keep pushing. And we call it re-engineering of products. So let's say you use sunflower oil, and sunflower oil price has gone up, then a lot of companies are looking for alternate sources, but also alternate products. And so all of a sudden, then there's entirely different entire matrix, food systems when you're using a different oil. The GFSI food safety management system, there'll be an increase in the depth of these audits. Now, we were just seeing before COVID, that was 2 years after GFSI was required, the audits were getting more intense, and suppliers and customers were having more detailed discussions about food fraud. COVID came along, and that threw everything. We're just trying to get assurance of supply. We're trying to get enough product. And so that was kind of on hold. I'm seeing a lot of this starting to pick back up as people are visiting more. They're going back and looking at things. And so you should expect that the audit depths are going to be deeper and the questions are going to be more pointed, more direct from your customers. And that's a combination of the audits themselves for compliance, but also these vulnerabilities that I just talked about. There's definitely regulator continued expansion. in this area, and I mentioned the USDA National Organic Program. There's a new proposed rule there that's very intense and very direct about food fraud. Codex is still working on a food fraud prevention paper. I think they're in year 8, but it's moving forward. And the key for you is that you don't have to worry about that, because really the scope is all the same as what we've been talking about. So back to regular business, COVID, supply chain disruptions, and what we're really looking at and seeing is this shift to management systems and these overall risk control systems. And I'll go through some of those in detail here. So what to do? So all of a sudden that sounds really intense, but simple. That's the key. Start simple and then get more intense as you need to. And overall, you see at the bottom here, the food fraud prevention strategy and management system. Think of this as a management system, not just a one-time event. And what it will do is it'll build a foundation to address supply chain disruptions. And that leads to resilience and a response system. So there's going to be, I guarantee there's going to be a lot of supply chain disruptions in the next, whenever, forever. And they're going to be very different. So if we have a simple system, it can start. And it's focus on the basics. Focus on standard operating procedures. So every time you have a concern that comes up, you start with the same key questions and the scope, and you keep adjusting those. And focus on your management system. So I'd ask first for people, do you have this? Do you have what you would consider a real management system? Not just a strategy on paper, but regular meetings, activity, things like that. Do you have standard operating procedures? And also then what is this? What does it mean to be simple? Because that sounds pretty complex. Bottom line is having a system and then identifying what you would do as a standard response. Let's say that if you found, just like if you found metal shavings in a product, you have a standard response. So the same with food fraud, that if you all of a sudden have a food fraud incident, you have a list of steps you'd take. So how that starts at the very basic is to remember what the GFSI requirements are at the most basic, and that's to have a vulnerability assessment and a prevention strategy. So right there, it's already splitting this activity down to the 2 areas. So one is to assess it, to figure out what your problem is, and the next is to have a plan. And in that plan, it's not just a one-page strategy or one single document. It's now shifting to more of, again, a management system, ongoing activities, monitoring the process, proactively looking at it. Now I'll give you some details of what are some best practices there. So that is then to have a true management system process. So we want to create a formal way to review food fraud prevention. You want to think of out-of-the-box disruptions or problems, because COVID, a lot of people kind of ignored that for a while, but there were some things you could have done early on. With the supply chain disruptions of Ukraine, Russia, there's things that you could, if you looked early and just ask questions, what would happen? Even for the first week, you could consider that grain shipments and sunflower oil shipments may slow down a bit. So that could have led to some insight. And so you really want to include those out of the box, which is non-traditional, new, different type of problems. Now you might decide that that's nothing to worry about right now, but that's great. You've already reviewed it. And maybe you say, okay, well, when should we review it again? So maybe 1 week after the start of that, then a month later you look at it, and you at least look at it monthly. Then you have a process. Actions you would take is so you figure out there's different levels of actions in these management systems. So let's say there was an ice storm in Texas, the state of Texas, and it shut down about half the U.S. for a while. So when we see that ice storm right now, your first action is operational. That's now immediate. What would happen? So you'd look at your own inventory. You might, if you have trucks that are leaving the port of Los Angeles heading to Miami that drive right straight across the state of Texas, then you might reroute those trucks. That's operational. That's right now. You might order more product from customers that are near you. Tactical. So the next level, once the initial crisis calms, you look at a little deeper. So you say, well, should we really be sending the trucks across Texas anyway? Or maybe we should have better communication with our truck drivers so we can reroute them earlier. Maybe we should look at the weather more. See, that's higher level. Then finally is strategic, changes at the enterprise level. So you might say, well, we're a company based in Miami, Florida. Should we really be buying 100% of our product from Southern California across the US? Maybe you decide to get to some suppliers in your region. So you look at the actions. That's a management system. That's management thinking. confirm it all are addressed. So sometimes we work from problem to problem, and then the next problem comes up and we don't really do that really tactical thinking or strategic thinking. And you know what? We face the same problem over and over again. So that's the key, is to look at, to make sure in that management system that you are looking at these, each of these are critical. So what is that process? I always try to get to lists, numbers, easy things, just like the FSSC standard has that list of requirements. I try to have those as well. So first off, to look at this is assign a team. So if you're the one doing it, then you're your own team. If you're the boss, then assign someone to look at this whole idea of a food fraud prevention management system. Hold regular meetings. So that's a key. And maybe once a month you meet and you have a couple minutes that you look at those out of the box disruptions. You look at the newspaper, you look at the news to say what's happening, how might that impact us? How might that change our fraud opportunity? Again, remember, like Ukraine is a major producer of sunflower oil. So right there, just to say, we have no idea what would happen and what was going to happen, but there would have been in that regular meeting looking at that production. Then if you buy a lot of sunflower oil or any, then you could have predicted or thought through that there could be a problem. Document and refine the meetings. Look, this is just like HACCP. You know, in the HACCP plans, if you didn't document it, it didn't happen. So the same with food fraud, include that in your management process. Report and confirm your compliance with the goals. So on any team that's got a true management system, the key is policies tied to corporate. So basically then you would respond to your manager. Maybe after your regular meetings, your monthly meetings, you give a 50-word, 3-line summary of what you talked about. But the key is you're confirming, number one, that you have a process, number two, that you follow it, and number three, you refine it. That's all the managers really want to know, that you've got things under control. Review and refine. So Core mentioned plan, do, check, act. I teach Introduction to Supply Chain Management, and students hear that every single lecture. We're always looking to refine things, and that's such a key. And that's what we want to do here, is to then say, are we spending too much time, not enough time? Maybe food fraud is a very low problem for your company. Maybe you don't need monthly meetings. Maybe you have quarterly meetings. Maybe it's more of a problem. Maybe there's some new disruptions. So you say, you know what, we can't wait a month. Maybe let's meet again in a week. You want to constantly refine it. It doesn't mean you're going to do more. It actually probably means you're going to do less, because you're continuing to look at the process. So right there is a way to go from having just a prevention strategy on a piece of paper to having a real management system. So what does that management system look like? So we talk about VASIP vulnerability assessments. A real key here, it's a vulnerability assessment and critical control point plan. This is, it's all interconnected. It's not new. It's not unique. It's actually the application of a lot of other things that companies and industry has been doing all along. You see there, like ISO 9000 is quality management. ISO 22000 is food safety, which I mentioned. There's other product fraud standards, but there's also financial reporting. So things VASIP did include very early on, things like those other requirements. And then also on the right side is laws and regulations. GFSI is constantly adjusting the overall benchmark to changes in laws and regulations and things like that. So if you follow the simple food fraud guidance from FSSC 22000, that has real clear direction and alignment with all the vulnerability assessment requirements, period, all of them. I mean, well, every one we could find. So, and we're constantly adjusting it. So it's a great resource for you. VASIP is not new and it's not unique. It's just very specifically applied to food fraud. And the way then moving on into before our true management system is the processes itself. So we were asked this question by a number of people. And so we created an article. Co-authors are from Mars Food. And we looked at a proactive system for this management system. So what steps would be involved in the day-to-day activities? We wanted to connect everything to everything. There's so much going on here. New information, problems, countermeasures, risks, changes in risk. So much is exhausting. And so we wanted to put it into one area. Just as a reminder is that for financial reporting, whether it's Sarbanes-Oxley in the US or for a private company or across Europe, across the world, there are financial risk requirements and risk reporting. And we used the terminology and aligned with that. One of our co-authors was an accounting and information technology and accounting compliance professor. So she read through this and made sure that we use that terminology. So I'm trying to give you the confidence that this is something that is very efficient. And what does it look like? So overall, we look at the background, again, like the guidance document. The FSSC food fraud guidance document basically summarizes some of these things: academic disciplines, fundamental concepts. Remember, we're trying to protect the product. I mean, yes, first goal is to have compliance with FSSC, but ultimately we're all working together to control the product, to have it be safe and consistent product. And so here's 6 steps within that management system of what is that, when you're implementing your food fraud prevention strategy, what do you do? And the thing that's great is, again, it walks you through it. It looks at information, fraud opportunity. It's all around the fraud opportunity. And that's in the middle, the crime triangle. We're trying to reduce the fraud opportunity. We start with those assessments. So again, the FSSC 22000 guidance document is great at pointing that out. An initial screening at the start, and more detailed. Ways to look at new information as that comes in, and if you've implemented this management system, then you're proactively looking at that. You're asking questions if there are new incidents, if there's new scanning, new public policy. Then you consider those countermeasures. You should consider countermeasures after understanding your risk. So you read about a new thing, new device, new widget, new whatever, and is that good or bad in and of itself? Don't know. The key is how it impacts your system and how it helps control your products. Takeaway points. So first off, review your latest food fraud vulnerability assessment, search for any known incidents or suspicious activity. So step back and before you look at anything, see if anything's changed. Review and implement, consider the implementation of a real management system for food fraud prevention, things that I pointed out here. So after you look at your problems, then see if you really feel like, do you really meet monthly? Do you report on that? Is there something in policy? Review your audits and food safety management system standards. And what were the notes regarding food fraud? So with the auditors that are coming in, you've got your audit report. That will be your starting point, because the number one goal is compliance to the standard to be certified, and then you build upon that. So the starting point is looking at that, and that's clear that you can talk to your managers about to identify that. You may be fine, or you may have some challenges. And then finally, conduct an annual gap analysis to review your entire system. This is something we're really emphasizing now, is that even if you passed your audits the last 4 years and your suppliers like it, it's still to step back and do a gap analysis. And that's where we see this real focus on the management systems. So with that, I will stop share and turn it over to my colleagues.
Thank you, John. That was really interesting. And I really like the fact that you are referring to a real management system. We also talk about a live management system. So to emphasize that, this is not something you do once a year and then you put the book on the shelf and take it out again next year before the auditor comes. This is something that needs to be reviewed constantly. So thank you very much. That was really insightful. So for the next part of the presentation, let me just skip through a little bit. The next part of the presentation will focus on a different type of fraud, namely certificate fraud. Now today, as Cor has previously shown on the infographic, FSSC is one of the leading food safety certification schemes in the world. We operate internationally, and we currently have almost 30,000 certificates. Now that means that we are also now an intricate part of the supply chain assurance. And in many cases, a certificate is a ticket to trade. Unfortunately, that also means that certificate fraud is on the increase. So what is the purpose of this part of the webinar? The message is that you should not just accept a certificate at face value. And we're going to discuss 5 quick and very easy things to check when you look at a certificate and to verify the certificate authenticity. So first, look if the correct format of the FSSC logo is being used. So on your screen, you will see 3 examples, the middle one being the correct one. Secondly, look at the general layout of the certificate. And it's a simple thing like formatting. Is it aligned? Thirdly, it's very important to make sure that the correct normative references are listed. and specifically ISO 22000 with the current version, which in this case is 2018, the specific PRP specification. For example, if you have a company that's a food manufacturing company, it is the ISO Technical Specification 22002 Part 1. If you are a company that produces packaging, the technical specification would be ISO TS 22002-4. And in some cases, you might have an organization that has multiple technical specifications that apply. So really important to make sure that the technical specification is listed and that it actually ties to the scope of certification. And then the third point to watch out for is that the additional Fssc 22000 requirements, including the current version of the scheme, is also listed. Fourth, look at who the certification body and accreditation body is on the certificate and cross-reference that with our website, because only allowed and licensed CBs can offer Fssc 22000 certification. So if you have a certificate with a CB that is not being reflected on our website, it probably means the certificate is not valid. And then last but not least, and this is probably the most important of what I've just pointed out, is verify the certificate validity on our website. We have a register of certified organizations where you can check the actual status of that organization. So very short, but in essence, we need you to help us fight food fraud. So be aware, be diligent, do not just accept a certificate at face value. Please always check the Fssc certificate register. And if you cannot find a certificate on our website, or you have any other doubt regarding a certificate, then please do not hesitate to reach out to us. So thank you very much. And then I'm going to hand back over to Sam. I think we will now be doing our Q&A session.
Yes, that's correct, Elsbeth. Thank you. Thank you for this really nice explanation. And John, thank you as well. And of course, Cor, for your nice introduction. I've just been looking at the questions which are now popping in. And I'm happy to see that there's still some time left to answer a few of those. First of all, a short reminder. Yes, we will share the presentation and we will share the recording with everyone who has registered for this webinar. So tomorrow or later this week, you all receive an email with the recording and the presentation. So don't worry about that. And then I have a nice question for John to start with. John, well, we've been talking about food fraud, but what happens when you get caught? Or to look at this question, which action will occur when a big organization is being caught committing food fraud? Could you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, that's a tough one. So, I mean, the real key is, let's say that there was it was a crime of burglary or something. Then you would report that to the police, and all of a sudden, then that's something that would be it would be public record, and they would respond to it. The biggest impact you can have as a business is stop buying from that company. So immediately when you find fraud, sequester that product, and so that's the biggest impact. And if it's crossed a border, it's contact custom, your customs agency, because customs will also stop the shipment of that product. So as soon as you find it, the response for prevention is again to report the product and stop buying it. So sometimes a fraud is at maybe 1% dilution. They're risking their entire shipment for just 1% of value, and that can be a big deal. For yourself is immediately you realize that product, if you've used it, then the product that you've put it in, that finished goods, are unfit for commerce. They're illegal, and you need to recall those, and you need to not sell them. Hopefully You've got some review of your incoming goods. So those ingredients as they're coming in, you catch it before you start using it or while it's still in production, so you can reduce that product and have that destroyed.
Well, thank you, John, for your answer. Let me move on to the next question, because I see a few people asked, what is NB aspect? And I had to think, but then, yeah, we noticed the word NB is in Elsbe's presentation, and it's basically short for an important aspect. It's a non-English term, we think, but we'll look that up. But it's an important aspect. That's basically what it means. And Elsbe, I have another question for you. Would you please highlight whether the Fssc food fraud definitions remain the same? Particularly, Fssc refers to fraud affecting safety of the product. But based on your first slides, I have a feeling that this has emerged and seems to be covering all the aspects. For example, not only those affecting product safety. I would very much appreciate it if you could cover this one.
Oh, thanks, Sam. That's actually quite a complex question, I think, because from an Fssc perspective, yes, firstly, the definition is still the same. The one I had in my slide is a GFSI definition, but the focus of food fraud is product safety. It's always been product safety. It is about the consumer at the end of the day. But when you are evaluating food fraud, there are a lot more aspects to consider. And maybe that is sort of why the respondent maybe thinks it's more than product safety, but it is that you need to think of aspects that is not typical to food safety. Because we are used to doing food safety analysis and you think along those lines. But when you're thinking about food fraud, you also need to think a little bit outside of the box, and that's where the other aspects come in.
Well, thank you, Elsbe, for explaining that. And now let's move back to John.
Let me add to that question. I mean, a real key is that GFSI is a global food safety initiative. The focus is food safety at the root. So GFSI, as the US FDA laws, has a focus on public health and food safety. That doesn't mean that your only focus is on food safety. Your role is to help your company have product that's safe and legal all the way through. You're supposed to protect your entire company. So we've got these two sides of the vulnerability assessment. One is the requirements that are kind of less, the food safety requirements, only looking at the potential for food safety. But still, you need to look at all issues to protect your company. Also, any food fraud incident of any kind could be the root cause of a food safety incident. So just because horse meat and beef didn't have what would be widely considered a food safety hazard, I mean, it was food grade horse meat used in there, that just because it didn't have a threat doesn't mean that we shouldn't be very, very concerned about it. So that's a key, is just to identify that, yes, GFSI and Fssc have a focus on the food safety standards and the food safety issues because it's a food safety standard. That doesn't mean that your focus shouldn't be broad. Also, we're looking at the root cause. The bad guy is looking for any way to cheat you, any way to make money. So we need to look at some of those incidents that are beyond just a public health threat.
Thank you, John, for addressing that in a bit more detail. And I see a lot of nodding here, so I think we all agree on that. I have another question for you. On one of your slides, there is a bullet which says the reduced amount or intensity of oversight. I think, yeah, then we have to move a bit back in your presentation. Yeah. Don't know if you know the slide I'm talking about. Yeah. But would it be possible for you to explain that in a bit more detail?
Yeah, so think about the first months of COVID when you're home, you're trying to figure out how to have your kids off the Netflix while you're on a Zoom call so you can have enough bandwidth. We were focused on a lot of things other than every single detail of our job. We're just trying to get moving forward. And part of that was that we couldn't visit people. And so think about when you're onboarding new suppliers. You know, the supplier would probably come visit you. You'd go to them. You'd look at your plant, their manufacturing plant. You just had a lot less or very different type of oversight. Now, something we've learned over time is there's an awful lot we can do very efficiently over Zoom or a video walkthrough of a plant. But at the beginning, we didn't have that. We were just trying to figure it out. So in that case, in that sense, there was a lot less activity. Also, think about lab activity. Labs are having you know, constrained resources as well. So maybe we've got a little bit less testing here and there. So along the way, especially at the beginning of COVID, we had less oversight and less activity. We were desperate to find product. And so now that things are calming down more, we're looking back at those systems, and people like the US FDA. I was just at a meeting where they were presenting to the Peanut and Tree Nut Association, and they were saying that they were starting to really increase their inspections again. They'll be able to get out, they're able to do more swabs and have more oversight. So just because we've got maybe don't use the last 2 years as your baseline for what the level of intensity and inspection and oversight will be for food fraud. And from FSSC side, how does that correlate with what you've seen?
Yeah, I think, John, what you're saying is that COVID is, one of the things that COVID has learned us is that we are more flexible than we think we are. People are amazingly adaptive, and it has sort of put, how shall we say, it sort of brought new dimensions into the world of auditing, into the world of certification, that we previously just thought, you know, this is not possible. If you think about something like remote auditing, that was just something that was a no-no when you talked about the food production environment. But with COVID, we were forced to reevaluate and also to evolve with it. So I think that was the nice thing about COVID, but strange to use it in the same sentence. But it also pushed the boundaries a little bit for us as FSSC, but also organizations, the wider food industry, and I think just everybody in general.
Yeah, if I may add to that, I think what I also learned, what we learned, is also that looking at the management system approach, also in the COVID crisis, I think the fact that ISO 22000 asks not only for an operational risk analysis, but also an organizational risk analysis, that helped organizations very, very good to be very agile, to be flexible on also covering COVID as a potential risk. And I think that's also with food fraud. I think the whole organizational risk analysis gives really tools to organizations to also be better prepared on risks from food fraud. Because I believe food fraud will grow. We will have more food fraud in future. I'm almost sure for that, because raising the price, higher prices, raw materials, products, having problems in the world, that also gives more risks for, I think, food fraud, because it's more attractive to do it. So we need to be prepared, and I think that that risk approach can really help organizations to be prepared for that. Yeah.
If I may add to that, so I've had a crazy career, I guess. So 12 years at Chevron before coming back to get my PhD in anti-counterfeiting. And at that point, companies said they needed a risk assessment, and that led me down that path. Worked in food safety, criminal justice, now in Department of Supply Chain Management. And the key for me is my role is to look at introduction, the big picture. And so like that new book, the focus is on supply chain disruptions. And even more broadly than food safety, companies and governments are looking at supply chain disruptions in a completely new way. We always assumed that if there was a problem with one supplier, we'd be able to find the product someplace else, right? Maybe you pay a little more, maybe you have to expedite it. But all of a sudden then with COVID, and then now with the disruptions across Europe, that's not the case. There's just not the product out there. And we're now looking longer term, big problems of product that's not going to be available. So, you know, doing new product development with sunflower oil is, I was going to say crazy, but it's unwise, because we realize that the product is going to be in such tight supply. So if you have that, remember, management system, as Core said, operational right now, tactical, do we adjust a little bit, strategic, the highest levels, maybe you should recommend that your R&D teams aren't working on, using sunflower oil. My point is that even the broader businesses themselves and supply chain management, they're looking at this disruptions in a new way. And I think a science of supply chain disruption management is coming as well. And we just happen to be on the front end of it. I think the food industry is so much more coordinated. People like Fssc have been really thought leaders pushing GFSI pushing Fssc and the clients. And we have better systems in place. And so you follow those things like the food safety guidance, that forces you to look at the big picture. And as Cor said as well, you're starting to look at management systems. Management systems talk about looking at the entire process, and that's so key. So I think we're moving ahead. And as Cor said too, is that there's going to be constant change, constantly different. You're either going to chase it or you're going to be looking for it. If you're looking for some of these with a proactive step, then hopefully you avoid some of the problems, or the problems are less.
Thanks, John. Great.
Thank you, John, for your additions. I have a question for Elsby. So let's see what you think about this, because here's a question. Does Fssc 22000 require to address food packaging fraud vulnerabilities, especially keeping in mind increased popularity of recycled packaging and its availability?
Yeah, thanks. And that's actually a very good and valid question. I think people tend to think about food safety as being food, but it is more than just food. It's food, it's feed, it's also packaging. And packaging plays a very important role. And like the individual points out, also with the increased need to use recycled packaging, because we also need to be more environmentally friendly. So that's a very important thing to also consider. If you are using recycled packaging, where does it come from? Does it still meet the food safety requirements, but also does it tie maybe up to your vulnerability assessment? So yeah, very good question. And the short answer is yes, definitely. Packaging is part of the assessment.
Great. Thank you.
Yes. Sorry.
Yes, sure, Cor.
We sometimes don't realize that food fraud can happen everywhere in the whole food supply chain, even in the service area, transport and logistics.
Yeah.
I mean, you can also have fraud there. So we need to be aware that it can happen everywhere in the food supply chain.
And the key is what everyone's been talking about is management system vulnerability assessment. So you need to have a way to gather every little bit of information, every little insight. Now, it doesn't mean just like Cor said about transportation. So maybe it's a food grade truck that you hire, but they put it on the back of a pickup truck or something else. That's fraud, because they're misrepresenting the service that they're providing you. Now, how bad is that? Is that something you should wake up in the middle of the night sweating and worrying about? Probably not, but that's not the question to ask. Every issue you have, you should run it through the vulnerability assessment. What's the likelihood and consequence, and then identify it, because then you can monitor it over time. And maybe there is some problems later, but you at least assess it and move on. You have a system to look at it, and then you can sleep better at night.
Thank you, John. And to everyone who's listening and watching, I just noticed that it's, at least here in the Netherlands, it's 2 p.m. And that means our 1 hour webinar is over. But I also see still a lot of interesting questions. So what I would like to suggest is that for practical reasons, we will stop this recording and end the webinar. But for everyone who is interested, we'll continue for another 15 minutes or so to answer just a few of those questions which are coming in, because I think we are having a very good discussion here and a good conversation. And these are valuable questions. So for everyone who has to leave us, thank you for your attention. Thank you for signing up for this webinar and for participating. Again, we will share the recording and the presentations of this webinar with you, with everyone who has registered. And some additional information, like the guidance document about food fraud. And we will also, we have another Fssc Insights webinar coming up in November, the 22nd of November. And that webinar will be dedicated to food safety culture. The opportunity to register for this webinar, we will also share that with you. So for now, I would like to thank you for your attention. Please stay in the webinar if you're interested in listening to other questions we want to answer. And for now, I would like to stop the recording. Thank you.